Good morning. It's great to see all of you again at this fantastic Energy Disruptors Conference in Calgary. Very recently, I was able to spend some quality time with my parents, and it reminded me of a simple strategy I used to use with them as a young kid to present my annual report card from school. So I'm going to probably use a very similar strategy to present the report card of the energy transition to all of you today. Every time, I would go and ask them whether they would want to hear the good news or the bad news first. And for some wild reason, they would always choose to hear the bad news first. They probably wanted to get it out of the way as quickly as possible. So here's the bad news for all of us. Ocean temperatures, which are a key indicator of the level of climate change and global warming, used to be around 20 degrees centigrade in the 1980s. They went up by 0.2 degrees centigrade in the 1990s. They notched up further in 2000s, and they kept on going up in 2010s. And in 2020, the temperatures we saw were at the top end of the range of the previous decade. 2021 wasn't that difference. 2022 was as bad. And 2023 was kind of off the charts, right? It was out of the range, out of the bounds. And if you thought that was bad, this is where we are in 2024. Therefore, it is becoming imperative to start reducing emissions every year and get them to net zero on or before 2050. Thankfully, we're making some progress. In BloombergNEF's economic transition scenario, where we assume that no new policy support is given to clean energy technologies beyond what has already been legislated, we see annual emissions peaking now and declining slowly thereafter. And these are emissions from energy usage. But you would see that that leaves us with around 2.6 degrees of global warming, which may be unsustainable for many people and many communities around the world. There's some more good news, though. The amount of capital flowing in the energy transition is increasing every year. And last year, we saw a record $1.8 trillion being invested in the transition. A significant proportion of that went into two sectors. Firstly, electric transport, where consumers like you and me ended up buying electric cars worth $630 billion, and renewable energy, where almost $620 billion was spent in building new renewable capacity for power grids around the world. This is leading to a scenario where a lot of the new incremental capacity that is being built in power systems, as well as in road transport sector, is coming from clean sources. So most of the power generation capacity installed on power grids around the world now is actually solar and wind, and some other forms of clean energy like hydro and nuclear. And consumers bought a record 13.9 million electric cars last year globally. So we are starting to see acceleration of clean energy technologies around the world. However, we have to remember that changing legacy system takes a bit of time. So even today, even after all this records amount of new clean energy capacity that we are installing on power grids around the world, almost 60% of all the electricity generated globally is coming from fossil fuel sources. And less than 3.5% of all the cars on the road today are electric. So there's still a long way to go just to transition the power sector and the road transport sector, two sectors which we think are slightly easier to decarbonize. And what's going to compound this problem is the advent of new technologies like artificial intelligence. In certain power grids around the world, the demand for electricity because of new data centers and Bitcoin mining facilities coming up is humongous. For example, in Texas, where I live, a quarter of power demand in 2030 could be coming from these data centers. Interestingly, in Texas, almost 16% of power demand in 2030 might also come from oil and gas production. And interestingly, we are also seeing a scenario where some of the biggest buyers, corporate buyers of clean energy, are actually technology companies, the likes of Facebook, Meta, Amazon, and Google. Therefore, we think there are 5 key technologies in the phase 1 of energy transition to help us decarbonize the power and the road transport sectors. These include technologies like solar and wind, but also lithium-ion batteries, as well as electric vehicles. In each of these technologies, you will probably see S-curve kind of growth rates, even in an economically led scenario. However, to get to net zero, we have to accelerate and sprint even faster. And therefore, in the COP climate negotiations in Dubai last year, it was agreed to triple the amount of installed renewable energy capacity on power grids around the world by 2030. My team at BloombergNEF estimates that in 2030, the global installed capacity for renewable electricity will be around 9,000 gigawatts, which is only 10 to 11% lower than that stretch goal. So this is definitely a goal aggressively worth pursuing. In terms of battery storage, we have seen significant reduction in the cost of a lithium-ion battery pack around the world. However, when COVID happened, we saw a disruption in the supply chain, and we also saw raw material prices for things like lithium, copper, manganese, and so on go up. And therefore, in 2022, for the first time ever, we saw the prices of lithium-ion batteries actually going up a little bit. However, last year, we saw cost declines again. And I remain hopeful that around 2027, the average cost of buying a lithium-ion battery pack around the world would be around $100 a kilowatt hour. That's a very important number to look at, because once we hit that tipping point, we can really accelerate the deployment of stationary storage on power grids around the world to balance intermittent renewable electricity, and we will see a significant uptick in the demand for electric vehicles. And I remain hopeful because recently I was in Asia, and I went to tier 2 and 3 cities in countries like China and India, and I saw increasingly large deployment and growing deployment of electric vehicles on the road in those countries. And that gives me confidence that the energy transition and the electrification of road transport can actually accelerate. But if you remain skeptical, you need to know the story of this man, Jim Hines. In the 1960s, it was considered almost impossible for a human to run the 100-meter sprint race in less than 10 seconds, till he came along and in 1968 became the first man to breach that mark. And in the same year in the Olympics, he actually created a world record, which stood for almost 15 years. But that has not deterred athletes around the world to do even better, including this man, Donovan Bailey from Canada, who in the Atlanta Olympics in 1996 created a world record of 9.84 seconds. So I think we should draw some inspiration from these two athletes and other athletes around the world. But fully decarbonizing just the power sector and the road transport sector is not enough to get us to net zero. If we have to globally decarbonize the economy, we have to decarbonize sectors like iron and steel, cement, aluminum, petrochemicals, aviation, and shipping, the so-called hard-to-abate sectors. And we as BNEF think that there are 5 technologies which can help us get there. These include hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, nuclear power generation, and sustainable aviation fuel. Thankfully, we are making progress. We expect the amount of clean hydrogen generation capacity to increase rapidly between now and 2030. However, I must admit that these numbers could have been much higher if the anticipated reduction in cost of electrolysis systems would have actually materialized. Therefore, we are seeing a scenario where buyers are still a little bit wary of buying clean hydrogen. Today, we think there's roughly 1.2 million tons per annum of clean hydrogen binding offtake agreements around the world. This is a far cry from roughly 100 million tons of gray fossil fuel-derived hydrogen that the world uses today. And the number is even smaller if you consider that in 2050, according to our estimates, the world needs to use roughly 400 million tons of clean hydrogen. Another technology which is suffering from high cost and increased timelines in terms of deployment is nuclear power. The actual cost of building nuclear power in the Western economies is roughly 2 to 4 times of the anticipated cost from government agencies in these countries. But of late, two trends are standing out. Firstly, because of higher power demand in sectors like artificial intelligence, technology companies, digital technology companies are going out and signing contracts to buy more nuclear power. And governments are willing to invest again in this technology. And the other interesting trend is, in many emerging economies around the world, countries like China, India, and other countries in the Middle East, we are seeing governments more supportive of nuclear power. And therefore, perhaps, cost of this technology can start stabilizing and coming down in the future a bit. But beyond nuclear power and hydrogen, the technology that needs the most steepest ramp up in the decarbonization journey is carbon capture and storage. We are seeing some reduction in cost of CCS technology and a larger uptick every year. But if we were not able to scale up CCS technology, then there is very limited window left to attain net zero, and we might actually be left with global warming at around 1.9 degrees in 2050. And as emerging economies are growing, there's another sector which is really taking off, and that's aviation. If you go to, again, emerging economies like Indonesia, China, or India, you'd see rising air connectivity. And because of that rising air connectivity, you are seeing a humongous increase in demand for jet fuel. Again, a sector which is slightly hard to decarbonize. And the alternate left there, in some sense, is sustainable aviation fuel. We are seeing reduction in cost of sustainable aviation fuel technology as well, but a lot more needs to be done. Till now, I've talked about sectors and technologies, but there's another key set of players to help us decarbonize and get to net zero emissions by 2050, and that's financial institutions. At the moment, the major financial institutions around the world are investing or deploying capital, twice the capital in fossil fuel supply compared to low-carbon energy sources. This ratio should not be half. This ratio should already be 4:1. We need 4 times more capital to be deployed in clean energy today compared to the capital we need to deploy in fossil fuels. And so banks really need to step up, and financial institutions really need to scale up capital deployment in the sector. But here's the good news. The difference in the total amount of capital required between now and 2050 in the economic transition scenario versus the net zero scenario is roughly 20%. So we need roughly $215 trillion of money between now and 2050 if we have to get to net zero emissions and fully decarbonize energy use in particular. And that may sound like a lot of capital. That's roughly 7–8% of global GDP. So it's perhaps, again, a goal worth pursuing. I will leave you with the words of probably the most famous sprinter ever, Usain Bolt. He was once asked what his strategy is for winning races. And he said that there are better starters than me, but I finish really strong. And while I appreciate that the energy transition is only just beginning and we are starting to sprint, hopefully we can end this journey on a very strong footing. Thank you for listening patiently.